Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the session organizers for putting this together and inviting me to participate in it. This is my first time in Wales, so glad to be here. My name is Deirdre Appel, and I am with an organization called Open Data Watch. We are based in Washington, D.C., and we sit at the intersection of open data and official statistics with the aim of using development data to improve and achieve sustainable development. So I'm also here wearing another hat of Data 2X, so you'll see that logo throughout. They're one of our close partner organizations, and they're an initiative based out of the UN Foundation, and their aim is specifically on examining gender data gaps and filling those gaps for the Sustainable Development Goals. So we can go ahead and get started. Okay, so for Open Data Watch, we see our world through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. And for us, all roads lead to 2030, which is when this ambitious agenda is set to be achieved. So the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, as I'll continue to refer to them as, are a 15-year plan, a universal call to end poverty, to protect the planet, to ensure that people are living lives of peace and prosperity. They're a very ambitious agenda. There's 17 goals. There's 169 targets and 230 some indicators to measure each of those goals. Gender equality has its moment in SDG 5 specifically, but I think as you'll see throughout the presentation, gender equality is really embedded into the entirety of the SDGs. So here we see a breakdown on what I mean, that gender equality lives beyond just SDG 5. So UN Women had put together a list of 53 gender relevant indicators within the SDGs. You see that, of course, the most are in SDG 5, gender equality, but we also see a lot in goals like education, decent work and economic employment, and even peace and justice. But the thing with the SDGs that's tricky is that not all of them have been designed in a way where they're ready to measure. So not all of the data is there for these indicators. So when we look at the 53 gender relevant ones specifically, we see that not all of the data is available. And this is determined by what's called the tier classification for the indicator. So within this spread, you have 10 that are tier 1. Those are the really good ones. They have data that are widely produced and readily available. Methodologies and standards are in place, and international standards are there. An example of this one is an indicator measuring the proportion of people with mobile phones by sex, age, and location. And then you move to tier 2, where the data are not readily available, but the methodologies and standards are in place. An example would be an indicator trying to measure the time spent by women on domestic care work or unpaid labor. And lastly, we have tier 3, and these are the ones where the gaps really are present. No data is available, and methodologies and standards are still in the process of being tested. So an example of this would be the indicator that looks at how much government spending goes towards projects that disproportionately benefit women. The SDGs have a lot of these indicators that don't necessarily have the data just yet. But the story gets a little more complicated, and the task at measuring gender equality gets a little more difficult when you have, I think, organizations like Open Data Watch who look beyond the explicitly stated gender relevant ones and try to see what other indicators within the Sustainable Development Goals could or should be disaggregated by sex. And our initial research into this found that there are an additional 33 indicators that can be sex disaggregated, but aren't explicitly stated as such within their indicator description. So if we go back to this chart that you saw before, here's a breakdown of where you see these additional indicators showing up. The most is in healthy lives and in health, SDG 3, but again, you see it in peace and justice as well. And to get more specific, you can see some of the exact indicators that aren't disaggregated by sex in their description, but certainly could be if you were to, want to understand the number of deaths attributed by disasters, how women might be affected by, climate change more than others in the population. So this isn't to say that, our jobs as measuring and monitoring gender equality have to be more difficult. It's rather to say that gender statistics don't have to be a sector that exists on its own as something that's only in SDG 5, but rather something that can be mainstreamed into the broader statistical system and looking at all of the indicators in a way where we can have information on both women and men and different communities within the population. So I hope that gives a kind of broad brush of the role that gender data plays in the SDGs, and I think the critical and importance it has in it. But despite that, we see that there are many gaps in the tier classification, like I mentioned before, but in other issues like capacity and openness and just the basic availability of the data. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll be exploring the gender data gap through these three components. So this might break the rules of too much text on a PowerPoint, but I hope you can see it okay. So the first is statistical capacity gap. There are, a range of instruments that provide us with the information on, gender equality. The census, labor force surveys, civil registration, and vital statistics. And, now we have more innovative things like big data and satellite imagery. So there's a lot of information out there. Unfortunately, the gap comes into play with the capacity on an international level between countries to be able to produce this data. So when you look at this chart, you can see that some countries are, left behind in terms of their ability to produce. So this is taken from the World Bank Statistical Capacity Indicator, and it kind of ranks countries in terms of how well they do at the production of data. And you see that for a poverty survey, for example, which provides a lot of critical information about communities, that 46% of the countries haven't conducted a poverty survey at the recommended frequency. And then even if we look at time use, which is a critical input for understanding a contribution to the economy or unpaid labor, that only 88 countries around the world have conducted a time use survey. So if we think about closing a gender data gap as a function of the governments and the countries that we're dealing with, part of that effort will also be closing a statistical capacity gap to produce. So the second gap we're looking at is on openness. Every year, Open Data Watch puts out what's called an Open Data Inventory, which is a global assessment of the coverage and openness of official statistics in 173 countries. And in the ODIN, as it's called, it intends to be a diagnostic tool for countries to be able to see where their gaps might be, but also to improve accessibility by adopting open data practices. And the ODIN is divided into three categories. We have economic statistics, social statistics, and environmental. And within those, we have subcategories like education, health, and gender statistics category, which looks at, if you go onto your National Statistics Office website, can you find information, gender relevant information on child marriage or violence against women stats, or the percent of women in parliament or managerial positions. So with that, the gender statistics category, as well as some of the other sex disaggregated ones in education and health, we put together a gender data index. And the chart here shows the distribution of this index with the distribution of scores and then the number of countries that fall into those scores. So you see that, in terms of receiving 100, that there's few, actually no countries that receive a perfect score in their gender data index. In fact, the median coverage score was 32.4, which is well below the median score for some of the other categories, especially economic. But the interesting thing was the openness median score was much higher than some of the other categories. So the trend that you're seeing is, while gender data may be less available, when it is available, it is in open formats and such. So an interesting trend, but still room for improvement in terms of having a more favorable distribution of scores for gender data openness. Okay, and now moving to the third gap on availability, which is probably one of the most important ones. You know, you can't have open data if you don't actually have the data. I'll breeze through this slide because it's just explanatory of the project itself, but we're working with Data 2X to take on a project called Mapping Gender Data Gaps 2.0, which is looking at it's basically an assessment of 105 gender-relevant indicators at an international and national level. So it's similar to what I was describing before with the Open Data Inventory, but it's very specific on just gender-relevant indicators. And the goal here is to have a really comprehensive view of the availability of data at a country level, but also moving towards regional trends and eventually global trends. So the project we just started back in June. We've conducted a handful of country assessments in sub-Saharan Africa, 20 so far, so the data keeps changing in terms of the new assessments that we bring in. But here I'll just share some of the headline messages that we're finding through this work. So the first is that when we talked about what is a gender data gap, or is one present, the answer is much more complicated than just yes or no. We're realizing that, and I think went into it thinking that there's shades of data gaps, and it's inspiring what we're calling a typology of gender data gaps, which is looking at not just is the data available, but is it timely, is it prepared on the frequency it's supposed to, is it open, is it granular, issues like that. Another thing we're learning is because we're looking at both the international and national level of data availability, we're seeing a difference between what's available at a country level at their statistical office's website, as well as what might be provided by an SDG database or an organization such as World Health Organization. And the third is the differences between some of these categories, so the economic, the social, the environmental. Part of this project is to look at where the major gaps are, if in a country might be just the health or just the education sector. And we're finding that in each of these domains, half of the indicators are not sex disaggregated, and the environmental category lacks the most. And I think that this is an important fact as, with climate change and some of those issues, access to water, knowing those understandings of realities for women and girls might be quite important. And then the last one is a disaggregation beyond sex. So with the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, there's what's called Leave No One Behind, which is a campaign or this principle that sustainable development doesn't only occur at a national or global level, but should be something an individual experiences as well. So part of this is ensuring that different people within the population, disabled, elderly, refugees, migrants, all of them are considered as part of the measuring and the monitoring. And so what we're finding is when we look for sex disaggregated data and even some of these finer disaggregations, when an indicator requires a disabled status to be part of the reporting, it's rarely there. So if we're thinking about how do we understand an intersectionality of women, this is something that also comes up and can be considered. So starting to wrap up, the idea here is that if we think about gaps as being multidimensional and having different shades, we can also put this towards our approach to gender data and to have a more comprehensive approach as well. And a comprehensive approach would take on what we call every stage of the data value chain. The data value chain was something that was put together as part of understanding the life cycle or the path that data travels from its inception, its collection, to its end use and impact. Part of this came out of a project where we were trying to document the impacts of gender data to find stories that really held true. When you invest in data, you have positive outcomes for women and girls. But we were finding that not a lot of these stories got to this last stage of impact in a true sense of, decrease in maternal mortality or a change in budget, but were further in the other way on the data value chain where, perhaps it was just published and released to the public in such a way, but that wasn't necessarily impact in its true sense. So the idea here is that when we're talking about filling gender data gaps, following this chain in a way where each stage has a gender dimension or lens to it would be important, that you're collecting data that's filling a gap or a need, that you're publishing it in open formats or accessible ways for perhaps non-literate communities, even with a lot of work that they do on murals for data and whatnot, that you're connecting it or the uptake with the end users there, as well as the final goal of eventual impact. Okay, so the idea here is that Open Data Watch and our partner Data2X, we don't just try to poke holes and find the gender data gaps, but we also look for opportunities that you might be able to fill these gaps. And some of these that we're identifying is the following 5. The first is raising the profile of data. I think if you're within this community and a statistician or a data scientist, you see the value in data, and it's part of your ethos, I think. But for communities or people outside of this arena, you have to think about how you can make the case for raising its profile and showing that investing in data is as important as investing in, an infrastructure, a school, or a hospital. So part of that is documenting evidence of data impacts. Building partnerships between, especially for gender statistics, government ministries and the National Statistical Office. There's a great impact story of Vietnam where the Ministry of Culture, Tourism, and Gender worked very closely with the National Statistics Office there to do their first violence against women survey. So without that kind of partnership, I don't think it would have been as successful. Of course, make data open to allow academia, researchers, NGOs, anyone to be able to use it, to pull it apart and put it together and hopefully have some insights. An organizational strategy that mainstreams gender statistics in the national statistical system. And the last is achieving sustainable funding. This is an important one, especially at the international stage. You have to make a case for funding this, especially for limited resource national statistics offices around the world. They're already overstretched and under-resourced in some cases. So trying to build a case for better and more financing for gender statistics is another one. So I will wrap up there and just leave it on this note that the idea is that you're transforming, what we call a vicious cycle into a virtuous one of gender data. So I'll stop there and thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussions.
So thank you, Jen. Thanks for having me. I didn't have far to come. So I'm Claudia Wells. I lead the Sustainability and Environmental Statistics at the Office for National Statistics just down the road in Newport. So thank you for having me, even though it's really convenient for me. I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour about what we're doing here in the UK to collect more data disaggregated by gender with a very much SDGs focus. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the non-statistical indicators, in fact, how we report on potentially having policies in place to assure equality in the UK. I'm going to talk a little bit about time use, so that was great that was mentioned in the last presentation. And I don't think you can have a talk about gender statistics in the UK without talking about the gender pay gap. So I've got some slides on that as well. It never ceases to amaze me that even here in the UK, there are stark gender disparities in data. And that ranges from everything from women living longer. If you look at poverty statistics, women households are more at risk of poverty than male households. And that's not true, actually, if you look at the rest of Europe. So that isn't a standard that's true everywhere. And it goes the other way as well. If you look at suicide statistics, men in the UK are more at risk than women. So it's really important that we ensure that we improve this data, provide it, make sure it's more timely, because there's lots that we can still do here in the UK as well. So This is just a little plug. So if you want to find any of the data that's in my presentation, it's all on our national reporting platform. It looks like the SDG tiles. We're currently reporting 62% of data against the Sustainable Development Goals for the UK. We've got 9% of data that we're looking at and that's in progress, and 29% that we're still trying to find data sources for. So do go along, take a look at our reporting platform and give us any feedback. It's very much a work in progress. We've developed this in collaboration with colleagues in the United States, and we are working in Ghana and Rwanda to help them develop reporting platforms in a similar vein. So if you have any feedback, please give it to us because it's still an ongoing development. So let's think a little bit more about achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls in the UK. So these are the targets that sit under that goal 5. And if you look on our national reporting platform, you'll see this if you click on the goal 5 tile. So from my point of view, this is really great because we're reporting statistics or we're linking to policies against nearly all of the required indicators. We've just got one that's in progress, and that's the proportion of women making their own informed decisions regarding sexual relations, and that data should be coming up soon, so we have found some data source to report against that. But first of all, I wanted to look at target 5.1, so, which has got whether or not there are legal frameworks in place to promote, enforce, and monitor equality and non-discrimination on the basis of sex. So this is an area where initially we thought this will be fine for the UK. We can link across to our Equalities Act. So that came into force on the 1st of October 2010, and it provides a basic framework for protection against direct and indirect discrimination. But at the Interagency Expert Group back in April this year. So that 5.1.1 indicator was one of the tier 3 indicators that was mentioned in the previous presentation, which means that there wasn't any agreed methodology on how to monitor this. It has now moved from tier 3 to tier 2, which means we have some methodology, and that was developed by UN Women. And actually, it's much more prescriptive than we were expecting here in the UK. So it covers 4 overarching areas, looking at frameworks in public life, violence against women, employment and economic benefits, and marriage and the family. So what we've done at ONS is, these aren't official figures here in the bottom table. I should have that stamped all over them, apologies. So what we've done is estimate how we think we will score against the questionnaire that's been developed. And actually, we don't score really, really super well in all areas. So we did great in area 2, violence against women, score of 100%. But in area 1, the overarching frameworks, we're a little bit lower, 64%. And that's because the questionnaire asks about whether there are quotas for women in national parliament, and we don't have quotas here. And then it talks about whether there are legal frameworks to enforce those quotas. So again, we drop back. So even though we've increased the number of women in parliament in this country, we are not doing so well against this area. And it's similar when you look at employment as well. So the requirement under the employment and sort of maternity standards is that the statutory maternity pay should be no less than 2/3 of the previous earnings for all people. So we don't actually have that. So that might be great at the bottom of our distribution, but I suppose we might be thinking we might be paying too much for statutory maternity pay if we were giving a high-level CEO 2/3 of their pay. But it might be great for some of the people lower down the distribution. So there's some things to think about, and it really does give us food for thought about what policies are in place. And that's one of the non-statistical indicators. So I'm really out of my comfort zone as a statistician talking about that, but I just think it's really interesting in the way that actually internationally this may be monitored and it may be viewed, and how we'll be assessed as the UK in terms of how we're doing. Now I'm going to go on to one of my favourite data sources, which is our Time Use survey, and our release that fuels arguments in households across the country. So women on average carry out 60% more unpaid work than men in the UK. And we actually valued, and why is that important? Because we valued the total unpaid work in the UK as more than 50%, nearly 60% of GDP, which is amazing. It's a phenomenal amount. On average, men do 16 hours a week of unpaid work, which includes adult care, childcare, laundry cleaning, compared to the 26 hours that women do. The only area where men put in more unpaid work hours than women is in the provision of transport. And there's a little caveat in there, because that includes driving yourself around. So it's not necessarily that they're taking their children to school or looking after their elderly parents, taking them to the shops. So a serious disparity, even though there is a bit of a flippant side to that. So, but do go along and have a look, because we've got this fantastic tool, again, on our website, that allows you to value your own unpaid work. So you can really fuel those arguments in the households that you live, and you can put in the hours and look at how much unpaid work you are. So here is an example that I've just filled in. These aren't the hours of unpaid work that I do, but for example, you can look to see how much per week that work is valued and how much per year it is, and it's quite a lot, and it's really very, very interesting. So do, again, have a look. There are lots of other indicators you can see that are green that we're reporting against within the SDGs framework. Things that I've mentioned before, like the number of women in Parliament, and the proportion of managerial positions held by women. I think this is really interesting. So what I've done here is pulled out some of the disaggregations that we've got available. So you can see that the sort of like grey line in the middle shows that there's about 30% of women in managerial positions, but when you disaggregate that by the type of job, you get really stark disparities. So that line at the top is health and social services managers and directors. Women are much more likely to hold positions there in the sort of 70% range than they are when they're looking at production managers and directors, which are below that 30% line. In fact, they're only hitting about 10%. And this is where we emphasize that disaggregation is really important. It's about that leave no one behind. What's the most important disaggregation for this country? And we're really committed to providing the detail behind the data and those disaggregations available on our platform here. So yeah, like I said, it's all really about the disaggregation, making the invisible visible. So it's not just about sex. There are other disaggregations required by the SDGs, including age, ethnicity, disability, race, income, geography, and migrant status. And in the UK, we've signed up to an inclusive data charter, which is a commitment that here in the UK, we will make progress to disaggregate data as much as possible to ensure that everyone has a fair opportunity in life. And you can read more about that if you Google it and look on the gov.uk website. Here is an example where we've gone further than just disaggregation by sex. So this looks at target 5.2, which is about violence against women and girls, but also resonates across to goal 16, which looks at sort of sexual violence, some of the indicators that were mentioned in the earlier presentation. So this slide shows that actually women who have a disability are more likely to have experienced partner abuse in the last 12 months than women who don't have a disability. Women who are younger, women who are mixed or multiple ethnic races are more likely to experience partner abuse. And women living in households with incomes less than £100,000 were 4 times more likely to have experienced partner abuse in the last 12 months than women with living in households with income over £50,000. So some really, really shocking disparities here in the UK to really make you take a step back and think, what can we do about this, I think. So, like I said, I'm going to move on to a presentation on gender data in the UK isn't complete without looking at the gender pay gap. Really, really topical conversation over the past year. So this slide looks at data sourced from The Guardian and is the large firms reporting their results. And it's a really interesting slide. Apologies if you can't see it very clearly. The data on this side is where women are paid less, and the data on that side are firms where women are paid more. So this side, the outlier here, we've got Ryanair, the very worst, moving down to Barclays, Eton College, the Telegraph, the Guardian itself, actually, Google, Coca-Cola, the Royal Mail, and then slipping into the blue zone, where women are paid more, we've got the British Museum, the British Heart Foundation, the Royal Trinity Hospital, and Wagamama's. So some interesting data there. The grey sort of blob at the side is where employees aren't reporting a gender pay gap. So you might think these are companies to aspire to be working at, but we're looking at companies like McDonald's and Primark. So maybe we do have something to learn from their business models if we don't have pay gaps there. Or maybe there are other reasons why they're reporting that. But I'm sitting here from ONS. What am I doing? Reporting data from The Guardian. It's interesting, but let's actually have a look at our annual survey of hours and earnings. It's the most comprehensive survey of earnings in the UK. It's based on a 1% sample of data from the PAYE system. So much more representative and comprehensive and robust data than was displayed in our previous chart. And here you can see the official measure of the gender pay gap. This compares the median pay for men and women in full-time employees, which is the preferred measure. And the gender pay gap has declined steadily over the last 20 years, falling from 17.4 to 9.1% in 2017. But it doesn't compare equal pay for equal work. So what do I mean by that? Well, men and women do different kinds of jobs. So this looks at the characteristics of the job. So this shows the gender split for full-time employees by occupation group, along with the gender pay gap for that group. And so what you can see here is the high concentration of male employees in the higher paid occupations, certainly the top two, which underpin that positive pay gap. And we can also see there's a trend for higher pay gaps in those occupations that are more concentrated with male employment. But it's not just the types of jobs. If we have a look at this chart, which shows personal characteristics, proportionally, men were more likely than women to work in full-time jobs across all age groups. This, coupled with the knowledge that full-time jobs pay more, on average, than part-time jobs, helps to further understand that pay gap in the UK. And the point for this and the previous chart is that the official gender pay gap measure doesn't capture characteristics such as these, which might be helpful to explain why we're seeing that pay gap. So we've done some more to look at the gender pay gap by age and working pattern, and men and women have a different distribution of earnings from age groups 30 to 39 onwards. So what we've done is we've published an article that really looks at the nitty-gritty of this, and we've tried to decompose the pay gap into what we think we can explain by characteristics that we've got available in our data and what remains unexplained. And this is what I'm going to try to explain to you here. So just over a third of the pay gap, so 36.1%, can be explained by differences in characteristics held by men and women. The majority of this, so that's the 23%, is made up by those different occupations, with the next largest contributor, working pattern, contributing to those differences between men and women. There are also two characteristics, that's age and business side, which contribute negatively to the explained gender pay gap. And that's because women, on average, hold more favourable, in terms of pay, levels of these characteristics. Bearing in mind we're just looking at pay when we're talking about favourable characteristics. So finally, there's the unexplained element, which is still really, really big. This could be comprised of a few things. For example, there are some characteristics we think influence pay, but we haven't got data for on that data source. Things like education, childcare responsibilities, the number of children in the household and so on. They're just not captured in our annual survey of hours and earnings, so we haven't been able to use them in the model. But it's also possible that the unexplained element, of course, captures the discrimination, but it's not at the moment possible to quantify quite how much. So I will happily provide you a link to that report if you would like more information. So do let me know. So what are we doing about this at ONS? We're setting up a Centre for Inequalities data that looks not just at gender and sex data, but across all of the protected characteristics in the Equalities Act. And we're going to concentrate on bringing together information on equalities and inclusion, looking at best practices and methods, and then identifying where there are gaps in our evidence base and developing data to fill those gaps. We've had an initial release coming from the Centre which looks at an inequalities data audit. So it looks across all of the data sources we have here in the UK, and it's a sheet where you can search and find out which surveys have that characteristic that you're interested in and the link is there on the slide. So do take a look at that. And we will have more coming out from that Centre for Inequalities soon. So that's me done. Thank you very much. Any questions, do email me. Thank you.
Hello, I am Natasha Davis. I am the Policy and Research Lead at Chwarae. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to say at the outset, I am not a statistician. I am a user of stats, and what I'm hoping to do is provide a bit of an overview of how an organisation like ours, who are working on the ground to overcome some of those inequalities that we've heard about, is making use of gender data, the value of that data to us on a day-to-day basis, and then touch on some of the challenges that we encounter when we're trying to access that data. So I thought I'd better start with an introduction to who Chwarae are, for anybody who's not from Wales. We are Wales's largest gender equality charity. We've been around for 25 years, and broadly speaking, we're looking to deliver our vision of a fairer Wales where women achieve and prosper. We look to achieve this in a number of ways. We work with individual women around building confidence and skills and broadening horizons, work with employers to build those inclusive workplaces so that everybody can thrive and reach their full potential. And we work with policymakers, decision makers, and educators to tackle those wider structural and societal barriers. We focus very much on women's economic empowerment and equality. To focus our work, we've got 3 strategic objectives, working around women in the economy, to build a Wales where women achieve and prosper across all sectors and all levels in the economy. Women at risk, making sure that women are empowered to achieve their potential regardless of their background, social status or geographic location. And women represented, building a Wales where women are visible and are influential across all sectors. Now, in order to deliver on these objectives, we undertake a range of activities. We do a lot of practical intervention work on the ground. We've got projects like our Agile Nation 2 programme, which is working with women and working with businesses. And we do a lot of influencing and advocacy work, looking to inform, lead, debate, provide critical analysis of government policy in Wales. Most recently doing that through the gender equality review that the First Minister commissioned to achieve his goal of making the Welsh Government a feminist government. So briefly in terms of where we fit, I guess, in that wider global SDG agenda, very much sort of the work we're doing in Wales looks to address those inequalities that contributes obviously to the UK's performance and ultimately hopefully to that sort of global shift where we see equality. And gender data is really important to our work to help us benchmark, to help us set visions, and to help us shape our interventions. In terms of how we use data, I would say quite simply, it's the foundation on which all of our work as an organisation is based. It shapes our influencing work, but also those practical interventions that we do on the ground. It allows us to speak confidently about the issues that we know need to be addressed. And it helps us to demonstrate the evidence of need, the need for intervention, and the need for action in key areas. It also helps us market those interventions to employers, to women, to influencers who perhaps are not as aware of the extent of the problems that we're facing. It helps us to measure progress and also measure the effectiveness of our own work. Obviously, our interventions are aimed at delivering on those wider contextual issues. Our work through our Agile Nation 2 programme is very much focused on helping to reduce the gender pay gap and improve the proportion of women in senior positions and women who are progressing in sectors where they're not making up the majority of the workforce. And actually, those interventions also allow us to collect gender data as well. So we're not just using, we're collecting data as well. The key way in which we use gender data is to measure the effectiveness of government policy and programmes and to inform our own influencing work. This also involves a range of activities, but also touches on those indicators. Here in Wales, there is a link being drawn between the SDG aspirations and indicators and what we're doing through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is essentially our Sustainability Act. That is supported by 46 indicators that are supposed to track progress, and gender features quite strongly, perhaps not as strongly as I would like, but quite strongly throughout. The gender pay gap is in there, and there is a steer that most of the national indicators should be measured using disaggregated data by a quality group wherever possible. So that would include indicators around the percentage of women, people who are moderately or very satisfied with their work, or the percentage of people who are on permanent contracts. Those measures are very important to the Welsh Government's decent work agenda, which obviously from our perspective, we need to be able to assess whether or not it's delivering on a gender perspective. So gender data really does play a crucial part in our scrutiny of the government's work. We use it in our media and campaigning work to draw attention to the key issues, make sure we get buy-in. For example, we're very keen to push for more women to be represented in politics. It's those hard-hitting figures that show just the slow progress we're making, particularly at Westminster level, that allows us to get buy-in often, and also the data that demonstrates the impact that measures that are unpopular in some corners, such as positive action quotas or women's shortlists. It's that data that shows how impactful that seems to have been in particular parties that allows us to start moving the discussion and debate on with those perhaps who are more cynical about those measures. And it's fair to say that as the policy and research lead and within my team, we're using gender data on a day-to-day basis. It's informing what we put in briefings, it's informing what we put in our consultation responses, and it's informing what research projects we might want to commission or take on going forward. I thought it would be useful as well to give a bit of just an overview of some of the data that we use as an organisation, perhaps to give an idea of the range of data sets that we're drawing on a day-to-day basis. We do gather data from a wide variety of sources, but that does include those national data sets. Unsurprisingly, the annual survey of hours and earnings is a big one for us. From that, we would draw down information about average pay, average hours, and we would get those for the UK level, the Welsh level, but also really importantly, the local authority level across Wales, so we can see what's going on across Wales as a nation, as there's some quite different trends happening across the country. The annual population survey is another big one for us. We draw a lot of stuff from here. Our focus, as I said, is very much around economic empowerment. So we draw a lot of economic stats. That would be the economic activity rate, the economic inactivity rate by reason, self-employment, employment by occupation, qualification levels. We draw an awful lot of data down from that data set. And again, breaking it down to that local authority area so we can get a picture of what's going on across Wales. Workforce, jobs and census, another couple of data sets we use, although to a slightly lesser extent, and obviously problematic with the census as we get further away. It becomes older data, obviously. And there are data sets that we're not yet using. Big data sets like the National Survey for Wales, which as a smaller organisation, we haven't necessarily had the time as yet to work out what we can get from it, how we get that information, and how easy it would be for us to sort of then present that information in a way that's accessible for the people that we're working with. We also draw ad hoc bits of information from various research and reports that are carried out by others. The EHRC, for example, is publications I draw on quite a lot. And as I said, we're also a producer of gender data. We carry out our own research, whether that's commissioned or carried out in-house. Our most recent report in Men's Perceptions of Gender Equality offers us some data around men and women's perception of issues such as whether or not equality has been achieved, whether or not men and women are treated equally in the workplace at present, and whether or not they're feeling the personal benefit of interventions like flexible working or shared parental leave, for example. In terms of how we access gender data, I can't stress enough how important it is for us to be able to access freely available data. I use NOMIS almost every week. That allows me to pull various bits of data down around those economic indicators. This really is an invaluable resource for us, and as somebody who hasn't really had any formal training in how to work with statistics, being able to explore things like the national and regional profiles that you can see on there has given me an insight into just the variety of information I can pull from particular data sets. ONS and Stats Wales, those websites, absolutely crucial. With the ONS website, the releases themselves, being able to access the data that sits behind the releases, the blog posts, and those interactive tools like the Unpaid Care Calculator are so useful for us to be able to just get a sense of what data we can draw down. And we do occasionally make specific requests to ONS and Stats Wales. That, again, is really, really helpful, knowing that you can shoot off an inquiry and usually expect a timely response, so you can kind of see, if you can't see where exactly the data is, to see if it can be pulled together is very, very useful. And another route we used was taking part in the analytical volunteering scheme, which I don't know how well is known about. We used it a couple of years ago, and we had a statistician come in from the ONS who was able to then work with the census data set and allowed us to pull information around transport and commuting patterns, which in turn allowed us to produce a report, which then allowed us to do some lobbying and advocacy work. And as a result, we've been involved in the development of the accessible transport objectives in Wales. And there's a focus in there around making sure that there's flexible multi-use discounts, which are particularly beneficial to women who tend to work part-time and tend to rely on public transport more. So there's a direct line there from us being able to access that data set to us being able to put in place, hopefully, something that will see a positive change in the future. And just to sort of wrap up my contribution, really, is just to touch on the challenges that we as a third sector organisation encounter when we're trying to access gender data. It's not always easy to access the data we would like to work with, but recognise that the cause for that is often issues like sample size for Wales, which is not an easy solution. It's not an easy issue to address. The availability of Welsh-specific gender disaggregated data is obviously quite important. This is becoming less of an issue, I would say. I've been working in sort of policy field for about 4.5 years, and I think now it is the norm for data wherever possible to be published that is disaggregated, at least by gender. When I first started, we were constantly asking, specifically around apprenticeships at the time, for data to be provided that was broken down by both gender and the sector that apprentices were going into. That's now freely available on the Stats Wales website, which is great. So we're definitely seeing movement on that issue. That being said, there are still some challenges. I mentioned the wellbeing indicators earlier on. Sort of some data around those was published for the first time in the first annual wellbeing report earlier this year, I think it was. And while there is a steer, although not a legal requirement, to break down those indicators by protected characteristic, a number of those key indicators at this stage haven't been published with that data. So those ones that I referenced, particularly around the percentage of people in employment who are on permanent contracts and who earn more than 2/3 of the UK median wage, wasn't provided with disaggregated data. That's a significant problem for anybody, organisations like myself or public bodies who are involved in either delivering the wellbeing agenda or scrutinising the wellbeing agenda. It's very tricky for us to see whether or not that is delivering across the board if those indicators aren't regularly being published with that disaggregated data attached. I think some of that comes down to, similar with the SDG indicators, the data set's not necessarily been available at present, disaggregated to enable that to happen. And as I said, it's also very important for us to be able to pull that gender data at a geographical level across Wales, at that regional or local authority level. We know that Wales is quite diverse. There's a clear urban-rural split, and being able to break that data down to that level is really, really crucial for us as well. The second challenge I wanted to highlight, and I think both other speakers have touched on it, is intersectionality. This is increasingly important. There's a focus from government on looking at things through an intersectional lens, and from organisations like ourselves, and I think that's an important step forward. Example with challenges would be specifically around pay data. It's not easy for me to see what the gender pay gap is by age in Wales, because I don't think I can pull the data off that allows me to look at gender and age for Wales. That means obviously that I can't work out whether or not Wales is performing better or worse than the UK overall in terms of that motherhood pay penalty. It might be better. Our gender pay gap is 15% for all workers, which is a little bit lower than the UK level, but I can't actually tell you for definite whether or not we're doing well there. Similar issues if we want to sort of intersect any data around ethnicity and race and gender. We know that BAME women tend to face multiple barriers, challenges, disadvantage when they're accessing employment. It's not easy to get that data at the moment. And that's going to pose a challenge for us as an organisation. Our next piece of research is looking to explore those barriers, and it's probably going to require a lot of specific requests to ONS or Stats Wales to try and get that data, because there are issues around sample size, etc. So that's going to be a challenge for us. And then the final challenge I wanted to say was quite simply knowing where to look. Like I said, I'm not a statistician. I didn't have any formal training in terms of how to access stats, etc. And I genuinely have learnt quite a lot just by playing around on Nomus and seeing what I can pull off. And I'm not sure that everybody working in my field is aware of just how much data there is available to you out there, completely free, just to play with and analyse how you wish. I certainly don't think that many people are aware of that analytical volunteering scheme that I referenced. That's an invaluable resource for organisations who don't have in-house research or data analysis staff. And in terms of looking forward to solutions, I think I referenced very briefly earlier on the gender equality review that the First Minister and the Welsh Government have commissioned. Data inevitably is going to be a big part of what is considered in that review. As part of phase one, there was a review of what's going on internationally, and the nations that were viewed as performing well, unsurprisingly the Nordic nations, often were publishing regular gender statistics in one place, whether that be in a publication in the way that Sweden do, or whether that be on an online platform where you can quite clearly see gender disaggregated data across key indicators. It's a real hope from us as an organisation, and I'm sure many others, that's a goal that the UK and then Wales really can be looking towards and aiming for, so that data helps to drive sort of political discourse and public discourse around sort of gender equality, and perhaps makes it more of a mainstream issue than perhaps it is at the moment. And with that, I'll wrap up.